This is a Founding Media podcast.
I am here with my guest, Alexis Jones. And I was thinking about you today, and full disclosure for my View from Venus podcast, I have known Alexis since she was very young, and she was my son's high school prom date.
I know, Jimmy Hamilton, glory days.
And
miss that
was
guy.
extremely proud of you and everything that you've done. But when I was looking at it and reading all about all your honors and everything that you've done, I thought, why should people listen to a podcast with Alexis Jones? So I wanted to list the people that do listen to you. The NFL, Google, NCAA Division I college football and other sports, Netflix, Dell, Pepsi, Nike, and the United Nations, not to mention Oprah. How about that? That's pretty impressive.
I feel very overwhelmed now. Now I'm like, I have to be articulate and funny and charming. And
You are all those things. But before you were all those things, you were on Survivor. So I think we have to start with the question everybody wants to know. How was that experience, and was Survivor, is it real? Do you really eat like
I tell
worms
people
and
they
stuff?
would never show what really goes down because it wouldn't be entertainment. It's 100 times more real than anything that they show on TV.
So it's worse?
It's 100 times worse than anything they show on TV. Yeah, I mean, they didn't show any of like the crises, especially for me. I broke my hand on our first challenge. They edited that out. I macheted my foot on day 19. They edited that out. I was the only contestant that got stung by one of the world's most poisonous scorpions 3 different times, edited all 3 of those times out. And then I blew out my knee on day 31 and they edited that out. So I was like, what? And whenever you see it, torrential rain pour, and then 2 minutes later, it's like, and then there's the rainbow. For us, those storms would last 17 hours. So, I mean, it's hard when you put, it really is, you're taking city slickers and you're putting them out in the middle of nowhere and asking them to survive. And it is so brutal. And there's so many things I'm not going to tell you because it is disgusting and gross about sanitation and hygiene. And that, it was really hard. It was brutal.
So after surviving that, you felt like you could do anything. And so I want to go right into kind of your entrepreneurial journey a little bit, because that's what this podcast is about. So through, you say, innovation, authenticity, and kindness, and I love the fact that you include kindness, you started out all about empowering women. So while you were still at USC, you founded, is it I Am That Girl? Mm-hmm. I Am That Girl. Tell me a little bit about that and why you started it there and then.
Sure. I mean, what I love about getting to have this conversation with you is because you've known me forever. So since I was just a young buck, and growing up in Westlake was really challenging because it was a very wealthy school, wealthy environment. And I think that I probably had all the normal teenager insecurities. And I think those were really kind of exacerbated by the fact that I lived in this very wealthy community,
it's
but my
bubble.
family, it's a
total bubble, and it still is.
Yeah, and yet my family wasn't wealthy. And so it was just kind of this like glaringly obvious thing that just kind of made all my insecurities even more. And so when I got a scholarship and I moved out to California and I went to USC, I realized that I was then going to, top 3 most expensive private schools in the country. Thank God I got a scholarship. But I mean, it was Westlake on steroids. Because it was the same environment. It was people who could afford that kind of tuition. And so again, now I'm displaced. Now I'm living in California. I don't really know anyone. I only know a handful of people. And so I remember sitting down with 6 girls in my sorority, and I said, we have a lot of conversations about things that don't matter, like clothes and shoes and movies and boys
and guys, yeah.
Like all of it. And I said, and it's amazing. It's such a luxury of a first world. But what if we had conversations about things that did matter? Would you come and would that be interesting? And they said, well, what do you mean? And I started talking about my fears and my doubts and my insecurities and the things I woke up with that morning struggling with. And also my hopes and my dreams and my aspirations and everything in between. And they said, yes, absolutely. We would show up for that. And I said, great. And so that first meeting, those 6 girls showed up. And 6 meetings later, we had 347 girls showing up. Wow. And we kept outgrowing like venue after venue after venue at USC. And finally, at a certain point, teachers are coming in being like, what is this? This isn't an actual class. And I was like, this is real life 101.
Well, and it was something that was born, I think, from what you've told me from the very beginning when we first talked about it, of a kind of unacknowledged need.
Yes.
It was something that was always below the surface that needed someone to bring it up, to give it air, and you did that.
And I think especially as women, because we're not born threatened by each other as women. I think that is a very learned behavior, and I think that is a cultural script that is handed to us from such a young age, and then we adopt it as truth. And so the other thing is that so often I feel like in these situations we can find ourselves as women walking into situations, and obviously at that moment for me at the college level, walking into classrooms, walking into parties, and all of a sudden sizing up all the other girls and not realizing that we are all perfectly wonderfully flawed, and we all walk around with that as the glue that holds humanity together, is that we all have these fears and doubts and insecurities, and we just had nowhere to talk about it. And we had nowhere to ask the hard questions, and we had nowhere to take our frustrations, whether it was with the environment or politics or our own body or the relationship that we were in. It was a safe place where we could put our guards down, and we could come honestly. And my one rule in these little groups that were coming together was that, I want everyone to feel seen and heard, and I want them to feel like they belong. And these weren't girls that would necessarily be friends otherwise, but they knew that when they walked in, that the baggage of what we've been told of these are the visible and invisible limitations of women don't exist here. And in this space, we have permission to be fully honest and fully seen, and to dream as huge as imagined. No judgments. And sometimes when a girl is starts bawling, and it was amazing because this is our default setting as little girls. When you're a couple years old, it's so easy to walk up to someone and be like, hey, I want to be your friend. I like you. Yeah. I like your backpack. Can we be friends? And then we get into this weird adulting where that's not appropriate anymore. We're playing cool. And in that space, there was no playing cool. It was, I'm going to show up, and sometimes I'm going to be awesome, and sometimes I'm going to be just struggling, to get here, and I get to be all of it.
That's wonderful. So take me from that to today, 1.2 million different members, I assume, and 24 countries.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's always the Frankenstein of its own, right? That's always kind of the impetus is when you have the courage to put something out into the world, and just say this needs to exist. And then it's its own beautiful entity. And of course, the funny thing, the backstory that a lot of people don't necessarily know is that I Am That Girl was built off of 23 interns that were working out of my apartment. So you talk about badass girl power.
And that's while you were still at USC.
Yep, that's why I was still at USC as an undergrad. And I put out this Craigslist ad, and it was if you want to change the world and you want to fight for girls and you want to not get paid and do insane hours and all these things. And I kept thinking, oh, it'd be so great if I had one intern. If one person responds to this Craigslist ad. And I was in shock within 24 hours. It was hundreds of girls reaching out and valedictorians of Ivy Leagues saying, I will move to LA. This is exactly. And so I always say that there's this irony about millennials and being a millennial, in that we're often criticized for being the world's most entitled generation. And I'm a hopeless optimist. So I always take the slant of that's a great thing, in that you have a generation who has the audacity to think that they could actually change the world. And so for me, seeing all these girls showing up being absolutely, and so I tried to look professional. I think I put on some cheesy suit, and I showed up in Coffee Bean to do my quote unquote interviews. And they were just so overly qualified for this. And so I ended up hiring 23 of them, and I put them in different departments, and it was in my living room. And so, I would call a meeting. I would sit in the middle of the living room, and I would call a meeting, and I would say okay, our 3 girls from accounting, I need accounting over here. And they would meet me in the middle. And then I'd say, I need our marketing team. And then they would meet me, and the amazing thing, and looking back, those really are glory years, because, it was the hustle. it was.
Well, we'll talk later. I need that Craigslist ad.
Oh gosh, I gotta find it.
Yeah, that's something. I have some interest in that. So the movement was to inspire girls, you say, to be, love, and express exactly who they are. And from that, it's grown tremendously. I mean, you're associated now with, I guess, I don't know. There's a huge team. I looked at it online today.
Yeah, it's an amazing team, and the team is always evolving. People coming and going and adding their little bits of flair and their magic. And again, it's also a testament to what happens when extraordinary people come together.
And did it spread kind of organically? How did you end up in 24 different countries?
Very organically. I think it's also a testament to our influencers who've been involved, just because they're such incredible spokespeople and people who are always, speaking on behalf of the organization and showing up at events and writing forwards to my book. So really grateful for that. But again, I think it's one of those things that when you ask the question of like, how did this video go viral? Like it is this like intangible force that it had. And maybe, you give a spark and then just this bonfire erupts. And that's what it always felt like with I Am That Girl was, I was but one girl who realized more than anything that I needed something that didn't exist. And sometimes we think that is selfish, that we're like, I'm going to go and change the world. And whenever I give any talks anywhere, I'm always telling people like, stop changing the world. Just change your own. Just fix your own. Just heal yours. Just do what brings you the most joy. And then you have a shot at doing something extraordinary. And I Am That Girl, certainly that.
I want to talk to you a little bit about something that was near and dear to my heart, your work, which plays into I Am That Girl, your work with Lizzie. Lizzie Vasquez, who, for people who don't know that are listening to the podcast, was bullied online and called the ugliest woman in the world when she really had a medical condition where she could not gain weight. And from there, she did an extraordinary TED Talk, and you were also instrumental in the documentary, which was wonderful about her. But talk to me a little bit about Lizzie and the bullying and how that came from a lot of your experience with I Am That Girl, as well as as your personal relationship with her.
Sure. That was at a time where I'd taken a sabbatical from I Am That Girl to write the book, also called I Am That Girl. And I also, around that time, fell in love with a lovely fellow that you also know that we grew up with, Bradley Buckman. And that was kind of a moment where I was deciding, at the time I was living in LA, I'm obviously from Austin, and it was like, am I going to move back to Austin? If I am, what am I going to do? And so I phoned one of my very best friends, Sarah Bordeaux, and I said, hey, I'm thinking about organizing a TED event for Austin, a TED Women event, because we've never had one. Would you want to be involved? Would you want to produce it? And she said, great. So like about this time next year. And I said, oh no, it's in 64 days or like something insane, to raise the money, to put on an event, And she was like, are you crazy? And quickly followed up by, are you crazy? Yes, you are. Of course you are, because so am I. And absolutely, we have to do this. And so then I was in charge of curating the speakers. And that was when I found Lizzie. And I'd read about her story, and I got on Skype with her and immediately fell in love with her because, to your point, it was so in alignment with the work that I've been doing with I Am That Girl, because one of the biggest challenges you can imagine within girl world is bullying. And bullying has gotten so sophisticated now, given technology.
Cyberbullying, yeah.
Cyberbullying specifically. And it's something that a lot of parents actually can't really understand the gravitas and the impact that it has on young people's lives right now. Because bullying used to happen out, on the playground, or at school, and you got to come home and you had a reprieve from it, right? And then you'd have to muster up the courage to go back to school to face your bullies, and even that isn't healthy for any child to be in that ecosystem. But what's so hard about cyberbullying today, using technology as a way to bully, is one, anonymity, is that you no longer have to face the person that you're bullying, which from a whole medical statistical standpoint actually has been proven that you can be exponentially more vicious. You say things that you would never have the courage to say to someone's face, using, getting to having the luxury to hide behind a screen. So that's one aspect, and that coupled with the fact that it's 24/7, that children really can't get away from it. And so they're being attacked, especially when it's coming from so many people, in a way that they can't even really defend themselves. And so for me, seeing this really intimately and being a quote unquote expert on cyberbullying and being called into all these conferences and speaking on behalf of of girls everywhere. Of course, when I saw Lizzie's message and how she overcame it and how she continues to overcome it, both physically when she's out and about, but also the way that she combated it online with such grace and strength and humor. She's hilarious. I was not expecting her to be as wildly inappropriate. I have a very inappropriate sense of humor, and so does she. And so we really bonded over that. But it was a no-brainer. Of course, again, one of those, we invited her to speak. Sarah made a very last-minute decision to have her actually finish our TED Talk that entire day with Lizzie, and it was the perfect right decision. And of course, she got a standing ovation. We never could have anticipated that she was going to get 10 million plus views. Not that we were surprised, but again, you can't manufacture this kind of stuff. And so again, it was a reminder that message of kindness was resonating, and that you don't have to have the same condition. I think there's only 6 people in the entire world who have her condition of inability to gain weight. So there's only 6 people who even kind of look like her in the world. And so she is incredibly unique in that sense. But to see her choose to have ownership over her life, and more than anything for me to realize that the irony of her being called those horrible things online, the irony of that is that she genuinely is one of the most beautiful people that I've ever met.
She is.
And
inside and out.
Infectious. I mean, she is just one of those girls that you meet and you
laughs,
hug.
you just melt.
You just melt. Everyone wants a best friend that's like Lizzie. So
great.
she was the poster girl for me of choosing to be kind in a sometimes cruel world. And selfishly, I needed her to be out in the world doing the work that she was doing, amplifying her message.
Well, and you amplified it through the documentary as well. You were executive producer. And you mentioned briefly just a minute ago, another one of my favorite people, Sarah. So talk to me a little bit about what it means to have a partner that's also a best friend, as far as in an entrepreneurial journey, it seems to be very important.
Yeah, I mean, I think so many things. Sarah is I mean, she's more than a best friend. She's more than one of my bridesmaids. She's more than a sister or a mentor. I mean, she plays so many of these roles in my life. She's just a couple more years older than me, that it always seems like she's just past that chapter in her life. And she's given me so much wisdom over the years and really ushered me into finding my own voice and figuring out who I want to be in this world and how I want to do the things that really make my heart light up. And so I think it's really unique. I think she and I have an incredibly rare relationship. And one of the things that she's done such a great job, specifically entrepreneurially, is that she insists on radical candor. And I think it's what's allowed us to work so well together, especially as women, because again, it's one of those ecosystems, it already sets us up to fail, right? The minute that you're like, oh, 2 best friends are working together on a project, and who's going to get more credit, and who's going to, all that stuff. And
well, observing the 2 of you together, I never saw that ever.
Well, and I think that she and I are both so intentional, not only about that, but we have so much reverence for one another, and we recognize each other's strengths, and we simultaneously recognize each other's weaknesses.
Well, and you have a lot of respect for each other. I've seen you listen to her. I've seen her listen to you.
And so I think it's being able to also have a relationship with yourself to recognize when you're operating out of ego, because it's not if, right? It's when you kind of default set into something. And so for her, it was always, if we have those moments, and even though it sounds crazy, and even though there's shame, right, associated with like, oh my gosh, is she getting more credit, or is she getting more interviews than me? Or, we were like, here's the thing, based off of Brené Brown, because we're both obsessed with her, is we're just going to speak it out loud. Even if it feels embarrassing, even if it feels stupid, even if whatever, even the craziest things you can imagine of like, I feel like you don't even want to support me and you just want all the credit for everything, which I know is a lie. I know is not true. But it's like, we would just have this practice where we can say that to each other. I know that this is my stuff. This is my baggage showing up for me and my insecurities, but this is how I'm feeling. And there was always space to honor that and to say, thank you so much for sharing that. Now let me break down. Of course, I would never intentionally make you feel this way, And so there was just so much dialogue. And I think regardless of female-female relationships, professionally or personally, I think it makes it harder because of how we've been programmed as women to like always be nice and err on the side of, I just don't want to hurt someone's feelings. And oftentimes,
and we talk too.
Yeah.
We don't stuff it a lot. We talk, which men a lot of times will stuff it and then it all comes out at once.
Sure.
But one thing I think with, in my old age learning about ego is I have learned to stop myself if I am hurt, angry, or afraid. Because if I'm feeling those things, it means ego's involved.
Sure. That's so good. I'm like, have to write that down after. You have to remember to tell me that so I can write that down after. That's so good. I do the same thing. I'm like, am I hungry or tired right now when I'm fighting with my husband? I'm like, oh, wait, babe, I'm not even mad at you. I'm just really hungry. But it's that kind of self-awareness. And again, I mean, Sarah is like the queen of this is just, I mean, she models this so effortlessly, is being able to dip down into that and to say, can we pause for a second? I can tell this conversation is charged. I want to know what it's really about because it's never about the stuff that you're talking about.
No, it's not. And half the time it's not about you.
Yeah.
So in 2014, skipping ahead, you had I think I call it an appointment with destiny. You were asked to speak to the top, were they 12 high school quarterbacks in the United States about respecting women and had an aha moment, which became Protect Her. Mm-hmm. So talk to me a little bit about that.
I always refer to Protect Her as this is what happens when you say yes to the universe. This is what happens when God opens up a door and you're like, he's like, all you have to do is say yes. All you have to do is walk through. That's what this represented because to your point, I've been doing girl empowerment for over a decade. And that was really my niche. It was where I was super comfortable. It was where I'd worked really hard and felt really good about the work that I was doing. And then Trent Dilfer and Yogi Roth, a commentator for ESPN for a long time, and Yogi was a quarterbacks coach at USC and one of my dearest friends in grad school. So two incredible men that I love, that I respect, called me and said, is there any way that you'd come and give, the top quarterbacks in the country a conversation about respecting women? And at first I kind of laughed. And this is what's also funny is when you're like, wait, what? Why? Like, why me? Like, shouldn't you? And Yogi was like, are you kidding, Jones? Because one, no one knows football better than you. You grew up with 4 older brothers. You're from Texas. Like, you're best friends with our quarterback at USC. Like, no one is a diehard, football fan like you and knows football better. He was like, but also, like, all the work that you do with I Am That Girl, like, there's an urgency for you. And you have a name and a face and a story for every time people talk about these girls in theory. And I'm giving you direct access to changing the game in a completely different way by identifying the influencers in the game. And I mean, how do you say no to that, right? I was like, okay, great. And then the funny backstory that no one really knows is I ended up, my flight ends up getting delayed. I end up showing up. And by the way, it's like such a classic guy thing, right? They give me 0 notice. They're like, by the way, can we fly you out in like 3 days? And I was like, oh, for a talk I've never given, for a demographic I've never spoken to, I have no content, I have no talk. Like, I need actual prep time. And I was at my best friend's wedding at the time in Canada. And so they flew me out. I was thinking, well, at least I'll have a day to put together all this stuff. And I land that night after, I didn't get into like midnight, and I checked my phone, turned my phone on. I wasn't supposed to go till 4 p.m. that next day. So I was like, I'm going to wake up at 6. I'm going to have all day
the 6 a.m. call.
And when I landed, I have a missed call from Yogi. He was like, hey, by the way, just a heads up, we've moved you to the 7 a.m. slot. And so Trent wants to have breakfast with you at 6 a.m. And I'm like, clearly these men do not understand hair and makeup, right? I mean, things need to happen if I'm about to be on camera for television, like that alone. And I just remember calling my husband and like, I started bawling and I was like, I can't do this. I have to make up an excuse. I'm going to say I got in a car accident. He was like, you don't even have a car. I was like, good point. Terrible. So like, I have to come up with something better than that. But I was so scared because I just didn't feel like I was ready or prepped or anything. And my husband said, just get up there and talk and speak from the heart and say why this matters. And then he did give me one little pointer, which changed the game. Is he said, do you know what young men are going to be in the room? And I said, I do. And he said, well, if I were you, I would pull pictures of their sisters and moms and girlfriends. And I'd put it in your presentation.
I remember you told me that.
And my husband being a professional athlete for 9 years, he was like, we've heard this talk from every which way. They bring in officers. We've heard our head coach say, if you ever, and he said, it's really, I've never heard of a girl coming in and talking about this. He said, but you're going to immediately reframe it. You're not talking about girls in theory. You're not talking about the hot sorority girls that they're trying to hook up with. You are talking about the women and the girls that they love and that they respect the most. And if you can tie it back to that, and not that you should have to, right? I mean, just this idea like
you shouldn't have to,
everyone should be treated with dignity and respect, but that's not the culture we live in.
But when you first told me this and I first saw the pictures, I mean, you know how much I care about you and I love you. And I looked at the pictures and I thought, does she not even get that the first thing they're doing is looking at her and thinking they want to nail her? Because she's beautiful. She's hot. She's funny. She's all the things. And I thought, how to get their minds off of your physical presence and onto what they're really needing to talk about or what they're really needing to think about. Just reframing that. You had that hurdle to go over before they even would listen because they were looking first. I mean, let's be honest.
Sure. And I would say that what shocked me when you said, that was an aha moment for me. What shocked me was, 10 minutes into the talk after showing their sisters, and I memorized their names. So I was like, this is who I'm talking about. I'm talking about Jenny and I'm talking about Laura and I'm talking about Janae and, was how quickly their body language went
shifted
from like, oh, I'm relaxed, leaning back, maybe even giving eyes of like, what's up, girl, right? To immediately sitting straight up in their seats, like full attention, like, oh, you're talking about my people now. And, I always say like half the guys started tearing up. And that caught me so off guard that I was not prepared for such an emotional and visceral reaction to this conversation. Because like you said, I just got up and you start talking about stats and you start filling their faces in with those stats.
And see, I think if you had stood up there first and said 1 in 5, which I think the number is much higher, 1 in 5 girls supposedly is sexually assaulted when they go to college or has some form of sexual assault that happens when they go to college. I personally think the number is much
So that's based off of what
higher.
We know. So
right.
There are two stats. Some say 1 in 5, some say 1 in 4. But both of those stats are based off of only 20% of girls who will ever say anything.
Who will report.
Sure.
Exactly.
So when you do the actual math, I mean, you're talking about more than 1 in 2.
Do you know that I just read a statistic which scared me from Safe Place that said only 6% of women in Texas report. 6%. That's terrible. But anyway, back to Protect Her. So you went from that talk to knowing, from what you told me, to knowing this was another unmet need, something else that needed to be addressed. And you put together Protect Her and began to speak to entire teams for the D1.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, again, this is kind of that divine intervention, but what ended up happening was when everything went down with Ray Rice, and that was this very viral video, and it got a lot of attention, and suddenly sexual assault and domestic abuse was the #1 trending issue on social media. And this video aired on ESPNU the next week. And so it was like right in the midst, and this is before Me Too and Time's Up, and it's so funny how many people are like, oh, so you started this with the Me Too movement or the Time's Up movement. And I was like, no, this is 5 years ago. And it was divine timing. Was all of a sudden I was that girl on TV having tough love conversations with young men about why it matters so much that they respect and protect and uplift and encourage the girls and women in their life. And really, it was kind of a paradigm shift. As a feminist and as someone who was raised by feminists and my grandmother, just these powerful, strong, unapologetic women. That my kind of epiphany was also around, wow, we're really missing the boat to not include half this guy. Like, we're really missing the boat to not include half of humanity into this conversation because we actually need them. And it takes a lot of humility to say, we're not going anywhere. Like, we're not pushing humanity forward unless we can get everyone on board with this. And then what I found was, it's so easy to highlight the guys doing it wrong. It's salacious, right? It gets clicks. Right. People love it as headlines. But I will say, having spent the past 5 years now building Protect Her and speaking in locker rooms, and what very quickly when Me Too and Time's Up came out, suddenly I was being hired by Google and Dell and, all of you, like corporate was having problems. Because, of course, this isn't a locker room problem. It's not a university problem. It's a cultural systemic problem. So it's showing up everywhere. So all of a sudden what started as, I'm going to create this content, of course, which I hear hired Sarah Bordeaux to produce an incredible documentary, 52-minute documentary, and companion curriculum for it. But what started is, Protect Her is just for like male athletes in a locker room. All of a sudden became a much bigger conversation that was, how do you be a good human today?
Right.
Because it's not just about her, right? It's about how are we teaching people in all ecosystems to treat all humans with dignity and respect. And so then my work was really cut out for me, because all of a sudden West Point is calling, and, they'd never had a female speaker in the history of West Point. I mean, how many hundreds of years come in and speak on this topic? And so all of a sudden it was interesting being a woman who was suddenly seeing a lot of firsts. The first time that this happened, the first time I was invited into this room.
But I think that was because of the paradigm shift that you had when you realized that if you're going to teach men to respect women, they have to respect themselves first, because their disrespect of women, to me, comes from their disrespect of themselves.
Of course.
They wouldn't do that if they didn't, if they respected themselves, they would never do that. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, when you shifted from shame and blame to including them in the conversation. Because I think that you said one time, shame has never been an agent for change.
Sure. It's just not effective. And if that's what we're really after. And so I've sat in so many rooms in which women are angry. And by the way, it's justifiable. It's righteous anger. It's understandable. Yes. Right? And because we have to honor that, we have to create space for that, and we have to figure out how to help heal that, and not just in individual women. I mean, as collective femininity, we have to figure out how to love women back to life. And simultaneously, if our end goal is we want to see violence against women going down, we want to see sexual assault numbers going down, we want to eradicate, not just going down in a utopia, we want this stuff eradicated. Again, it comes back to practicality, and that is where I'm able to separate the emotional side and go into kind of the social scientist that I am, and to really understand that if what we really want, if that's our end goal, then purely from a data standpoint, we've never seen any kind of behavioral changes that have been effective using shame, blaming, or anger. And so figuring out, okay, we need to use a different technique. And in the different circles that I had the privilege of being in with women who are twice my age, when we first started talking about this, it felt very, they were like, what? What do you mean you want to include men? And I said, I just think as women, if we had the humility to recognize that what we've been doing isn't working, can we start from that place? Because again, we're talking 1 in 4, 1 in 5. And if we know that's less than 20% of the girls report, whatever we've been doing isn't working. So let's just try this. And if this doesn't work, great, we can throw it out as well. But what I'm finding is in the midst of, yes, there are bad apples, but I was in awe. And this is where I was like, my hope was just blown up, was I could not believe how many men were reaching out to me. Good men saying, how do I get on board? This is amazing. This is the first time I've ever not felt embarrassed or ashamed just to be a man. I may not be perfect, but I try really hard, and I love my mom, and my girlfriend is the best, and how can I love her better? And I was blown away by the volume. And anywhere from high school boys being like, how can I be a better influence on my basketball team? To CEOs, running hundreds of $1 million worth of companies and saying, I really care about this, and I have daughters, and I want to know what I can do. To Russell Wilson reaching out, and saying, I love my wife. I want to teach my son how to be a protector. How do I get on board? How do I do this? So I think for me, it was, they've been awaiting the invitation. They've been awaiting hey, you can come sit at our table. And not only can you, but we want you to. And we need you because this is a complex issue. And it is going to take all of us if we're going to see any kind of change in treatment of women, which, of course, the intersectionality of we can't talk about women without talking about Black Lives Matters, without talking about the treatment of the LGBTQ community and immigration. This is a conversation of...
Which leads to your be a human.
Yeah, be a good human is, kind of to me the next evolution. It's not about gender. It's not about sex. It's not about religion or ethnicity or nationality or age.
Or the way you look.
Or the way you look. The idea of being a good human is how do we come back to the basics? And I think that's the other thing is it's not about teaching anyone anything. It's how do we revert back to, the little kid inside of us who didn't know that any of that stuff existed? And what does it mean to be a good human? And how do we inject more compassion and kindness where we see criticism and shame? And I think being able to have really thoughtful conversations about intentionally creating those kinds of ecosystems from schools to organizations to company culture, I think that's the stuff that really excites me.
Well, I know you're a complete optimist. We talk about that a lot. Between the two of us, we talk about how sometimes we get knocked down with our optimism, and especially with things that are happening now. Especially with some of the talk that's gone on and some of the disrespect for women. How do you deal with that now as far as, I'm sure you get questions. I'm sure you must.
Of course. I think that depending on the day, I handle it better than other. And I think that's part of it is like when you're an optimist by trade,
you're human.
You're human.
It has to irritate you and it has to make you angry to hear some of the things. Sometimes I just sit there and go, I can't believe this. I burned my bra. I chained myself to tanks. I thought I was done. And now we're starting. To me, sometimes I get frustrated because I think we're starting all over again. But we're not.
Yeah, we never are, but I can imagine that sentiment. I think my mom has a very similar sentiment of like, what? I thought we were past this. And life is funny, right? And humanity is funny because it's always 3 steps forwards, 2 steps back, 3 to the side. And I think for me, like I said, depending on the day, there are days where my eternal optimism can outweigh whatever kind of negativity that I'm seeing out in the world. And, I can, like my mom always says, like a duck, it can roll off my back and I can be like, oh, another idiot saying idiotic things? Sure. Like chalk it up to a dime a dozen. And then there's some times where I'm like, are you effing kidding? So depending on the day, there are moments where my humanity outweighs the divinity that exists inside of me and everyone else. And I think it for any activist, for anyone who cares about anything, I think it is waking up and it is one day at a time, right? It's I'm going to wake up today and I'm going to see what kind of micro dent I can make. And then that self-care is a very real piece of it. And I think that's something I only recently kind of stepped into with my crazy around the world trip, was I just needed a break. I just hadn't traveled and I hadn't done anything for me. And I think I forgot along the way of like carrying the torch and wanting to make the world better and certainly starting with my own, that somewhere along the way I kind of lost my joy. Just for everything, for the little things.
Joy is so important.
Yeah, and I think there's a distinction between happiness and joy, right? Happiness is, to me, feels very external, and like red velvet cupcakes make me actually happy. Blue Moon is my favorite, like it makes me actually happy. And so, it's kind of these like kind of fun, frivolous things that can bring me happiness, and I feel like it's tied to pleasure, but joy for me is an internal thing. That like nothing from the exterior can give it to me. And to me, it's really tied to purpose. And figuring out how are you waking up every day. And it's the distinction between who you are and what you do. And who you are of, I can be the activist that I am. I can be the founder, the CEO, or how all the different labels, the author. But am I doing it with kindness? And authenticity. And am I doing it with humility? And am I making time for the barista at Starbucks when I pit stop and I'm running late? Am I just on my phone staring down, or am I taking a moment to look up in their eyes and to genuinely ask them how their day is and to wait for a response?
You'll be so proud of me. You won't believe what I did.
Tell me.
I took Kind bars with me. I flew out this weekend to go see my grandsons. And I thought about you because I'd been reading. And I took Kind bars and I took a whole box of them and I gave one to every TSA person. That I took the time and gave them to all the TSA guys and said, I just wanted to say thank you for being here, for showing up when I know you're not getting paid. And, so I thought, and they looked at me like, wow. And they said, lady, well, the first thing was I had the box. This was so crazy, TSA. Had the box in the bag. And they go, you can't have food in that bag. And I said, it's not open and it's for you.
Yeah.
And so they said, okay. They started laughing and they took it around the thing, So then they let me give them out. But anyway, of course, awesome. I had to break a rule when I was doing it. But anyway, back to the optimism thing. Yeah, I think joy for me and joy for you probably is something that you will be memorable. Happiness you experience and it's sort of fleeting.
Sure.
But joy is something that you always remember.
Yeah. And I think that's something I've also just made space for in my life of like hunting joy. I think that's a really important aspect of my life. Whereas before, I think I was all fight. I was like battling all the time, and then I realized that the battle is important, and it is just how I'm hardwired that I'm always going to be fighting for pushing humanity forward a little bit. And I just recognized, and it was a huge epiphany, because this crazy trip that I just went on, was that I also want to make time for joy.
Did you go, was this just a fun trip? Did you go with Brad?
Yeah, Brad met me for part of it, but I basically put together my bucket list, which is funny because bucket lists are kind of these like back burner.
Right.
When I start asking people, I'm like, is anyone actually pursuing a bucket list, or is that just kind of somewhere on a notes page on your phone that you never ever look at? And so I told my husband, I was like, man, I'm not going to lie, I'm getting burnt out. Like, I'm exhausted. I'd been on the road at that point over 220 days a year on the road for 13 years. And last year I was on the road 251 days. And I was like, it is just too, my body was saying no, everything, And so I told my husband, I said, I just put together my bucket list. And he said, came in and I erased everything in my office off all my whiteboards. And I just started like a maniac, just started writing down all the things that just bring me joy. That was the only line I was filling in. What are the things that bring me joy? And or the things I've always wanted to do. And as I'm writing them all down, he was like, wow, there's a lot of places you want to visit. And I said, yeah, I want to do an around the world trip. And he was like, oh, okay. And I said, for the next 100 days, this is the only thing I'm doing. This is my full-time job. And so I took a sabbatical from work. And for 100 days, all I did was literally cross off bucket lists. And that included Cuba and Antarctica. And then I did Japan, Bali, India, Cape Town, Rwanda, Ireland, London, home. And so that was part of my bucket list. But I mean, the thing is that it feels so ironic or counterintuitive for Americans to take a break because we think we're going to get behind in this invisible race that none of us are like actually participating in.
You know what I just did?
Yeah.
I went around the world too.
Yeah.
For a whole year.
And it's like the version of you on the other side of that, you're like, I didn't even know I could have more juice.
Well, and you remember what you're fighting for.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes you're just tired. And I was exhausted. And I was exhausted for a different reason because of an outcome that I didn't expect.
Sure.
And sometimes when you get knocked down, the only thing to do is get up and pack a suitcase.
Amen. That should be like the name of a book.
Maybe it will be.
The tagline. Gosh. Yeah.
You never know.
Yeah.
But yeah, I agree totally. Getting to meet different people, getting to see different things and relax a little bit and not have an agenda. Plus, I didn't have to be on all the time. And that's, I'm sure for you, that's something. Because when you walk out, you do have to be on. Because if you're not infectious, they're not going to get it. So that's part of what you speak, part of the things that you do.
Yeah.
So as far as I'm going to wrap up with lessons you've learned from your entrepreneurial journey and also what it means to have support from people like your wonderful husband and so many mentors, so many people who are always, when I say support, you have a lot of people that are always wishing you well. Always.
Yeah.
I mean, whether you realize it or not, almost every day. I do. I know lots of other people that do. But talk a little bit about the importance of having support.
Yeah. I mean, gosh, I think that's everything. If you've been, especially as an entrepreneur, I mean, most especially as an entrepreneur, because it is the definition of faith, right? Transcendent of religion. This is you are believing in something that doesn't yet exist. And every single day you're trying to, you're wearing 30 different hats to try and pull something together. You're asking people to have faith in you, in this idea, in this vision. There are no guarantees ever. And so, of course, it heightens every insecurity you've ever thought you had, comes out, especially in that world. So having a community who loves you and supports you regardless of your success or failure. And I think that's something I'm really learning right now is, can I be okay with who I am, Alexis Whitney Jones, regardless of the praise or the criticism? And
you don't have to bat 1,000.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so the idea that I have a community that loves me regardless, so loves me in a state of when I'm at my very best and when I'm having my worst day, and that they choose to show up and love me, I think that, and you nailed it. I mean, my family is everything, to me. And my husband, I still have to pinch myself that I ended up with that guy. And that's not even my closest friends and in my business mentors and, all the people who, as you mentioned, I may not talk to them every day, but I energetically feel them in my corner. and that means everything. As far as some of the lessons I've learned, I think a lot of it has to do with slowing down, which is very counterintuitive to my circuitry and to my DNA. And I think that as I've gotten older, I've recognized the power of slowing down, and that in stillness is where I find my genius exists, and my greatest wisdom exists in stillness. And again, it's almost like if I have a big decision to make, or I have something, like my instinct is I'm going to go do 3 shots of espresso and I'm going to get my entire team together. We're going to whiteboard and I'd like all of that like frenetic energy. And I think really only in the past year or so have I found it is always important to crowdsource, right? From your kitchen cabinet, from the people in your lives. And that group has gotten smaller and smaller. Sarah Bordeaux being one. I literally had a call with her today about an important decision that is coming up. But when I used to crowdsource 17 people to say, what do you think I should do? What do you think I should do? Now I have like 3. And I don't ask them to tell me what to do or what they would even do, because they're not me and they don't know every single piece of this, but I ask me questions that can help me find the answer that's right for me. And I think that's a really interesting distinction, is to have the confidence that I know how to make the right choice for myself, for my life, for my company, for my team, that I want to have confidence that I make good choices, not always perfect, and sometimes bad choices, and sometimes choices we have to like make up for down the road, but I can have ownership over those too. But I think having the courage to say that if these people are trusting me to guide the ship and to be their captain, then I can certainly take all their opinions, but inevitably I have to make a choice that's based off of
the buck
my
stops
gut.
here.
Yeah. And I think before I was always, as a leader and as a founder, I was always wanting to make everyone feel so included. And looking back, I think oftentimes at the expense of my own compass, of knowing what was right and making decisions that weren't necessarily in alignment with what I thought, but I was like, oh, I won't rock the boat too much because this is kind of what people want. And then later I'd be like, dang it, I knew my instinct said that was not a good, And so I think that idea of like getting really, really comfortable with the voice of your own gut. And again, it's never going to prevent you from never making mistakes, but even those mistakes are clearly necessary for your personal evolution. I think that's a big piece. And then the other piece I would say is this new revelation that if you don't have joy in your life, then what's the point? And if you've lost that joy, and I certainly resonate with that, if you've just gotten in the grind for so long, or you're, in motherhood and you're just like, you don't see a light at the end of the tunnel, or you're a triathlete and you're training, like anything that just feels grueling, that you're just waking up and you're in it, you're in the weeds, and you look in the mirror and you're like, I don't know the last time that I like genuinely felt joyful. I cannot over express. That's not a selfish thing to pursue. That's oxygen for our soul. And for a lot of us, we, have siphoned it off and we're passing out in our own lives.
Right.
Sometimes just pure exhaustion. But I would say that the fight, the hustle, the grind, it's all important and necessary. But let us not forget the power of joy. And how much farther that takes us in life.
I made a commitment about 3 years ago. I wrote it down when I was working on a particularly difficult project. And I'd actually had a conversation with Roy Spence about hugs and joy and things like that. So I said, Roy, I'm going to say that I am not going to live another day of my life without a moment of joy every day. I said, so I'm going to make a commitment that if I haven't had a moment of joy, I will have one before I go to sleep every night. I said, but if I have, I'll write it down, because I have this little book where you write down one line a day. And I usually put my moment of joy in the one line a day. And he said, well, how are you going to do that? And I said, well, if it gets to the end of the day and I find that I haven't had a moment of joy, I'm just going to watch some crazy videos that make me laugh. And I said, that to me, or watch some of those, the little kid videos, all those where they talk.
Yep.
I said, that'll be my moment of joy for a day. And I have been really good, I have to tell you. And last year is the first year I kept up with it 365 days. And I did every single day.
That's amazing.
So that's how we should leave it.
Yes.
And this has been my moment of joy today.
Oh, mine
is
too.
Being able to
Thank
see you. And I look forward to what's coming next.
Yes.
People can get in touch with you. I'll put all the information, but alexisjones.com.
Mm-hmm.
Yay. Thank you.
Thank you.
My sweet.